Midpoints and bisectors, going right along with congruent segments. A midpoint or a bisector is basically anything that divides a segment into two congruent pieces, okay? And so when I look at the example, I see that line that's drawn. That line would be considered a bisector if it splits this into two congruent pieces. In other words, if AB is congruent to BC, okay? If those two pieces are congruent, well, then that means that that line is a bisector because it cuts this thing in half. And the point B right here, the point at which this thing crosses, that is the midpoint, okay? The only difference between a midpoint and any other bisector is the fact that the midpoint is a point that represents the middle of this thing, whereas the bisector could be anything, okay? It could be a line, it could be a line segment, it could be a ray, that kind of thing, okay? So the bisector will always cross at the midpoint, all right? But either way, the spot where they cross is like the halfway point. It splits this thing into two congruent pieces, okay? For example, if the line drawn bisects PR, I want to find QR and PR, okay? So in other words, it's saying right here that this line right here bisects PR. It bisects that line down there. And so if it bisects that thing, if it means it cuts it in half, it means that I have two congruent pieces. So here Q is the midpoint. So QR over here would have to be the same as PQ, all right? They have to be the same because this thing's being cut in half, all right? Which means then, if I'm talking about the length here, QR we already identified as 17. Now I need PR. Well, this is segment addition. If the two pieces form that larger piece, then the two pieces add up to the whole thing. So the PQ plus the QR, the 17 plus the 17 should equal the whole thing. So that's a 34. Okay. If I look at the next one here, it says U is the midpoint of TV. Find TU and UV. So if U is the midpoint, so the whole thing is 122. Well, if U is the midpoint, it gets split into two equal pieces, which means I really just divide that 122 in half. And if I do that, this one gives me a 61 and a 61. Okay? And once again, they have to be the same. They have to add up to the whole thing. So each of those is a 61. And that's it. Okay? The midpoint cuts the thing in half. If I look at this guy, it says you want to hang a painting in the middle of a wall. If the wall is 120.5 inches long, where should you hang the painting? So I've got 120.5 inches. If I want to hang the painting in the middle, at the midpoint, I need to cut this thing in half. So this is basically like the question we just answered, except instead of 122, it's a 120.5. Okay, so I have to cut that in half. I have to divide that by 2. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to kind of do each piece separately. Okay, so let's take this guy, the 120, and then I'll do the fraction separately. Okay, so if I do the 120 and cut that in half, that gives me a 60. Okay. And now I'm going to do the fraction separately. And one of the best ways to think about this fraction in terms of cutting it in half, all right, is to think about your tape measure, okay? Think about your ruler. See, on the ruler, the 1/2 is right here in the center, right? And so from here to here, from the edge of the ruler to this guy is 1/2. So if I want to cut that in half, well, that would be this middle line. Okay, and so now when you look, this is broken down into 4 pieces. So cutting that in half would be right here at this guy. Well, that's our 1/4 mark. Okay, so 60.25 inches. Okay, and so again, anytime we're talking about this, and a great way to think about this, especially as we start to talk about more and more measurements and cutting those measurements into pieces and cutting them in half and taking them away, it's good to go back and think about your ruler, think about your tape measure and say, okay, if I'm at the half, let's go to the mark that's halfway in between there. Well, that's the 1/4. Okay, so that's how we divide those fractions. That's how we cut that in half. Okay, you could go the algebraic route and say, hey, dividing by something is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, that kind of stuff. But I think it's easier to go back to a real world context, to go back to the ruler and say, hey, I know where the half mark is. Let's go to the middle of that. Let's cut that in half. Well, that's the 1/4 mark. Okay?